3D. 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 Game developers couldn't seem to wait to start pushing polygonal projects in the mid-90s. Tons of popular franchises were given the 3D treatment at the time, with some faring better than others. Naturally, there were some hiccups along the way, with more than a few concessions having to be made. The technology was still in its infancy, so it forced companies to think outside the box. Franchises that existed in 2 dimensions had to switch things up. Tight, fast-paced platformers transformed into slower exploration games, favoring item collection over action. Some franchises skipped this initial console generation altogether, patiently waiting for the technology to catch up with their ambitious ideas. I had a hard time adjusting to these changes. I was an arcade kid at heart, and a lot of the things I enjoyed about quick, reaction-based experiences were being removed. When I first rented Mega Man Legends on the original PlayStation, I was mortified, probably a bit offended. Could I have been the first child to ever be triggered by a video game? It wasn't what I was looking for at all.
Mega Man? Mega Man? Mega Man? Can you hear me?
Recently, I nabbed a copy of the N64 port, and decided to give this thing another shot. I'm a bit of a Mega Man fanboy, so I basically bought it to fill out my collection. Throughout the years, I've read a lot about this spin-off series, and watched as its cult status continued to grow, so I thought it might be a good idea to see what all the fuss was about. For this review, I played through the Nintendo version first, and it was pretty good. I wrote out the script and was ready to do the voice work, but the fact that I hadn't played the original PlayStation 1 since the late 90s began to gnaw at me, so I picked it up as well, made my way through it, and decided to compile my thoughts on both games in one meaty video.
Huh?
The differences, right, well, there aren't many. For the most part, Mega Man 64 is Mega Man Legends. Capcom developed and released the PlayStation version as Rockman Dash in Japan first, and the following year in North America. The Nintendo port, predictably titled Mega Man 64, didn't drop until the tail end of 2000 in Japan, with a North American release 2 months later in 2001. A late addition to the console, considering how close Nintendo were to launching the GameCube.
Mega Man? Mega Man?
In Legends, you take control of Mega Man Walnut, a teenage digger living in a future world engulfed in water, where artificial life forms have replaced humans. This variation of the character was discovered as a baby within some ruins by Professor Barrel Casket and raised alongside his granddaughter, Roll.
Phew. Nice timing, Roll.
Anytime, Mega Man. I'm sorry, Mega Man. I had some engine problems, and...
It's okay, Roll. But I'm glad you showed up when you did.
The story is simple but ambitious, with a lot of new faces introduced through imaginative scenarios. Roll has been redeveloped into a fully fleshed out individual here. She's a competent mechanic who acts as Mega Man's spotter during digs, a common activity that many take part in throughout the game. As you roam around excavating mechanical nuggets from underground ruins, she adapts the refuse into useful goods, so she plays a pretty prominent role as the adventure unfolds.
Wait a minute, Mega Man. I'm going with you.
The wheels get set in motion with an intro that plays off the tired old Raiders of the Lost Ark trope. After this, a battle breaks out with what the game calls a Reaver bot, who's about as harmful as a hiccup due to a manufacturing error that mistakenly replaced its weapon with a citrus squeezer. Nope, not that one. Yeah, that's right. Events happen, everyone's reunited, and then boom, a disastrous event occurs, forcing our heroes to crash their airship, the Flutter, onto an island. This is Catalox, and everyone's about as useless as you'd expect in a game like this. You're gonna hear everyone shout Mega Man a lot here, which is beyond obnoxious, but it's hard to fault the voice acting too much. The medium rarely had quality, competent professionals lending their talents during this era, so it's par for the mid-90s course.
Ah, Mega Man! The police saw us crash land and came to check up on us. Well, you certainly put on quite a show.
I do wish they'd call the protagonist anything but Mega Man though. It's as silly as being named Awesome Dude or Jumbo Guy, and feels a bit jarring. The Ruby Spears cartoon that aired a few years before was guilty of the same silliness, calling him Mega for short in most instances.
Don't blame yourself, Mega. Failure is a human quality.
In Japan, he is known as Rock, which sounds monumentally better. Rock, roll, bass, treble, the music references, blues. I mean, you play a glorified trash collector in Legends who spends most of his time rummaging through underground caves. Rock suits the character more than ever this time around, and yet they went with Mega Man.
Hey, Mega Man!
Another arbitrary name change gets introduced with our goofy antagonists. In Japan, this group of pirates were known as the Bones because pirates. Get it?
If only we'd known there was someone like him here in the first place.
In the North American releases, they are now known as the Bonds, which sounds like an assembly of excessively agreeable French folk. This positive little flock from Paris, with an unlimited supply of oversized Lego men and mech machines, is led by Teaselbon, a manic-depressive Mohawk man with intestinal distress. Rounding out this cast of villains, we have Tronbon, Teasel's sister, or daughter, depending on the source, who moonlights as the most lackadaisical stripper Catalox has ever seen.
What are you looking at?
There's a lot more emphasis on world building with a much more detailed plot when compared to other Mega Man incarnations. Cutscenes frequently interrupt the gameplay as they usher the player to the next action sequence. Legends plays out like an old Saturday morning cartoon with over-the-top villains who exist solely to wreak havoc until the protagonist saves the day. The beats are predictably repetitive as the Blue Bomber thwarts the Bond's evil plans several times as the narrative plays out. After a big battle, the pirates retreat, swearing revenge on the polygonal hero. Rinse and repeat. We could destroy you now, Mega Man, but instead, we'll regroup to get you next time. It's easy to overlook the foolish narrative because the kosher island of Catalox is populated by some of the most charming characters in any game. They are colorful, reasonably well animated, and goofy with interesting little quirks. You've got the inspector who seemingly shared a class or two with the bumbling Clouseau, this lonely junk shop couple who get right up in your face whenever you enter their establishment. Years of marriage has deteriorated their love for one another. She's barren and he secretly blames her for not giving him the bundle of joy he's wanted for so many years. Mega Man enters and they shower him with support, the child they could never have. Oh, and there's this guy, a supersized kid who frequently forgets to take his brain medication. It's a real problem for him and his alcoholic parents. Did the booze come first? Who knows, but he knows he needs to take the pills, but his brain is so far gone that he forgets to take his pills. It's a whole thing. Speaking of circular situations, we have Roll, who can't seem to succinctly make a point. Most of the cutscenes are skippable throughout the game, but item descriptions and tutorials need to play themselves out. It wouldn't be so bad if Miss Mechanic here didn't feel the need to preface each dialogue dump with superfluous filler. Engaging in a conversation with her feels like I'm caught in a time loop. First, she lulls the Blue Bomber into a hypnotic trance by continuously shouting his name, no matter the situation. Mega Man could be a football field away, and she will call out to him no less than 6,932 times, until they are face to face. He'll be looking right at her in some scenes, and she still needs to announce it. No wonder Gramps looks like he wants to die. Sleep. Once his eyes begin to glaze over, she concisely makes her point, which should be good enough for any able-minded participant to follow, but no, she continues to reiterate whatever it is she's saying in a few different ways to really get it into you. It makes me feel like I'm in a cyclical, mind-numbing nightmare. Do you understand, Mega Man? Do you get it yet? What's worse is that the option to hear her ramblings again is the thing that's automatically highlighted, so you goddamn better not mash those buttons while she's yammering at you, telling you the same obvious thing in a completely different way, or you'll be forced to restart the pattern over again. The repetitive rotation of Roll explaining one point in a few different ways is a soul-sucking vortex of dialogue that can't be skipped. She will do this over and over again as your brain melts. Every time an item needs to be upgraded or a new situation occurs, it is necessary for her to over-explain the situation in a way that makes you feel as though you're caught in some sort of time loop. A repetitive vortex of complete and utter nonsense. You just said that, Roll. Why are you saying it again? Brevity, Roll. I understood what I had to do before you even interrupted me, you dumb fuck. Hey Jay, you got any of that brain medication lying around? Despite Roll's navi-negging, the tutorial stage itself is brief and does a decent job introducing the mechanics. mechanics. Mega Man's movements are passable, about as average as you can get really. You can only compare these things to their contemporaries, and 3D games weren't quite there yet, control-wise, if you know what I mean. Ocarina of Time fixed a few things industry-wide with its inventive lock-on system, but it didn't drop until 1998, almost a full year after Legends. There are a few controller options which I can appreciate, as I tend to prefer the alternate D-pad configuration to move Mega Man around. The N64 port defaults to this scheme straight out of the box, and I played that one first, so maybe it was a comfort thing. This isn't an action game at heart, and it's clear the developers spent some time working around the limitations of the hardware. Skirmishes rarely get overwhelmingly challenging, which is a good thing because the automatic lock-on system tends to be a bit floaty. It works, but the majority of the battles, big or small, rely heavily on strafing and spraying offensive fire. It's possible to manually aim all of the weapons by holding one of the trigger buttons, but doing so locks Mega Man in place, which isn't always the best strategy for obvious reasons. During my time with either version of this game, I only encountered one enemy that required me to deviate from the good old tried and true strategy of running around in a circle, spamming cantaloupe pellets. The getting around is fairly cloddish from top to bottom. Mega Man's run animation is almost nauseating to look at as he bounces up and down, stomping his massive Clydesdale feet. Making a 180 is like pulling teeth as he slowly pivots in the direction you want him to go, like a slab of concrete on a lazy Susan. The areas are large enough to make up for his limited ability, which is another example of the developers understanding their boundaries, but it still looks goofy trying to jitter the hero into position. Thankfully, the platforming is forgiving, and there aren't many situations where precision is necessary. I can only really think of one area where I struggled with the controls. This super simple puzzle sequence requires you to stomp 3 switches to unlock an energy gate. It only took a few attempts, but the mechanics weren't really designed to put up with this amount of accuracy, and the Capcom crew seemed to know it, which is why we don't get many situations like this. This is a pretty linear game for the most part. After the lengthy introduction and tutorial sections, a pattern starts to develop. Meandering about, chatting with townsfolk, and fetching items generally comes first. Then it's all about engaging in gigantic battle sequences that result in the Bond family fleeing, with their tails between their legs. I'll get you next time, Gadget.
Are you alright?
Catalogs is pretty much the perfect size to fit the events that occur throughout the game. There's a lack of freedom for the first few hours, which could definitely be a deterrent for some players. I mean, it certainly turned me off when I was younger, but the lively characters are so likable that these linear sections feel less like a slog. For the most part, I think the developers did a good job ramping up the excitement with gigantic multi-pronged battles, just when the chit-chat and rote item gathering starts to get tiresome. For an N64 game released so long after the original, there's not a lot that has been changed. Capcom jumped to the Sony system after the 16-bit era, along with a ton of other third-party companies, resulting in a limited library on the Nintendo device. Mega Man 64's controls feel a bit tighter, but at the end of the day, it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to draw distances and visual intricacies. The colors are vibrant with characters and environments that look more vivid, but the PlayStation original has better shadow effects. There's quite a bit more going on when it comes to the finer details in the Sony version as well. Yes, there's a bit of warping at times, but the downtown regions feel lived in, as opposed to the Silent Hill fogginess presented on the Big N hardware. The forest areas are more lush in the original as well, with two-dimensional slabs of foliage that don't stick out like a sore thumb. In a lot of ways, the N64 alternative looks like a rush job, with ugly tile rendering and outdoors environments that look to have been built from Lego scraps. I know third-party developers had a tough time with the Nintendo hardware, but I'm convinced more could have been done to iron out some of these issues.
I've never seen a sight like this before.
The voices also sound like they were recorded through a hollowed-out vegetable can here, but I'm sure this has more to do with the cart restrictions than anything. I'm not sure I'd go as far as to say the acting is bad in either version. It's definitely cheesy, but surprisingly effective in conveying the overall tone of the game. There were moments that genuinely made me chuckle, such as Diaper Monkey's refusal to give me a mechanical part because I insulted him, or the disgustingly inappropriate moment I walked in on roll masturbating to photos of Gutsman.
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
Whoops.
Get out of here now.
She's pretty.
Yes. And you can think of her as your sister.
Mega Man? Mega Man? Mega Man? Can you hear me?
When I wasn't on board with the silly jokes, I found the events easy to laugh at in an ironic way. The game is broken up into what I'd call 3 chapters. If you can brave the oppressive police forces that rule sous chef Mayor's totalitarian island compound, you'll acquire a digger's license. This item grants Mega Man access to the areas blocked off by law enforcers dutifully working around this autocratic island prison. It's within these underground dungeons that the game really started to work for me. The first few force our fearless little digger into relatively simple mazes to acquire refractors. These dungeon approximations are a breeze to navigate through, but there are branching paths and hidden rooms that break up the linearity a bit. The first 2 labyrinths involve some key hunting in order to remove shields around the rupee-shaped MacGuffins from the land of Hyrule, but after that, the objectives become a bit different. I was surprised when Roll got the ship up and running so early in the game, and how the story refocused on preventing the Tron Bonds from unearthing the island's treasure. The journey leading up to the underground ruins often starts with a fetch quest of some sort, before a massive battle presents itself against one of the antagonist's mech machines. Some of these larger scale encounters drag on a bit too long, but they're well-crafted spectacles for the most part. They're not very challenging, but oftentimes they include multiple sequences to play out on a vessel's singular energy meter, which can be a bit pesky. The first of these takes place on a roll-repaired boat offered to the gang by a shifty-eyed Wily. There are 2 layers to this sea battle, and it goes on for a while. At the beginning of the second skirmish, your companion will offer the chance to dock, save, and regain some health with the dancing diaper primate. None of the other large-scale encounters allow this from what I can tell, which forces you to do well through each phase of a boss fight. This isn't a big problem until you take to the skies later on in the game, where you'll need to restart the entire mission if you fail. And when you fail, this thing lets you know it with a game over screen that would make From Software proud. Now, I didn't have many problems with the combat until the final part of the sequence, where you're expected to destroy the final form of the Bond's airship while it sprays Mega Man with all of its firepower. This wouldn't be so bad if the on-rails section that preceded it wasn't as time-consuming and slow. By the time I got to this Falcon fight, I was already exhausted, and the camera really shits the bed here, making it a needlessly clumsy test of patience. Aside from that relatively minor flaw, these bigger battles are impressive, and kind of the stars of the show. Their spectacles more than anything else, but truly impressive for the time. When it comes to your garden variety baddies, there are quite a few variants to come up against throughout the dungeons, with fairly interesting attack patterns to suss out. Things stay dead, which makes it easier to navigate these mazes, and there's a clear, no-nonsense map that can be consulted at any point. Oftentimes, the larger ruins connect with some of the smaller dig sites, which gives the whole world a bit of a Metroid feel. Unfortunately, venturing beyond a dungeon's gates will respawn all of its inhabitants, which is understandable, but the map never makes it clear where the boundaries are. Most of the time, I thought I was exploring a new region within a ruin until I saw the loading screen, indicating that I had made an irreversible mistake, resulting in a fresh batch of baddies. Admittedly, this is a small nitpick, as it's always good to farm, but a simple warning that I was exiting a stage would have been nice. Zenny erupts from enemies, which acts as the game's currency. Collecting it quick should be your primary goal when these things blow, because it disappears after a few measly seconds. At times you'll be greeted with an unavoidable foe as soon as you walk through a door, but it's really easy to overlook these flaws due to the lax difficulty. All of the bosses both in and out of the mazes are vibrant, well animated, and detailed. Reaver bots make up the majority of the enemies, with most having their own distinct styles and attack patterns. As I said before, blindly blasting and strafing will get you out of most skirmishes, which is a tad underwhelming. Throughout the underground areas, Roll will occasionally interrupt you with navigational tips, but she also calls just to chat. This is one of my favorite things about the game, as it allows the player to get an idea of who these characters are in a more natural way. She even questions the actions of the diggers, wondering if all involved are doing more harm than good, since they are essentially invading the Reavers' homes. It would have been nice if we had more interactions like this throughout the adventure, and larger dungeons as a whole. It builds up the world in a way that feels less contrived than the formulaic info dumps that occur elsewhere in the game.
You know, we go around doing digs all over the place, but is it right?
Scrap can be found everywhere, from trash cans and boxes on the overworld to cracked walls below. Roll inherits an old vehicle early in the game that she rebuilds into a mystery van for her and Diaper Monkey to get around in. Mega Man can summon her from most areas on the island to save, recharge health, or tinker with items. Instead of defeating robot masters for power-ups, the Blue Bomber can get equipped with add-ons created by Roll from the aforementioned pieces of junk lying around. This is a handy system, pun intended. There are lots of upgrades to be built, but I found the menus a bit slow to cycle through, and having to return to the van really pads out the length at times. In this one ruin, I needed to blast through a ceiling, but I had forgotten to equip the appropriate weapon. It took me a while to locate the specific schematic required for the Buster part, which forced me to redo a large portion of the dungeon, all because I needed to return to the ship for Roll to create the thing. Fortunately, the underground areas aren't that large, so none of these excursions are downright awful, but it's little things like this that I wish were streamlined. The game has no problem excessively holding your hand when it wants to, but fails to communicate the little things organically at times. It's not a huge problem and not enough to even slightly piss me off, but it's also not perfect. After retrieving all of the rupees and getting the ship operational, the objective shifts to opening a main gate. This is also where the game gives the player a bit more freedom as more sub-cities reveal themselves. These can be tackled in any order, which is a nice change. In some ways, it feels like these were offered a bit too late in the adventure, but at least the option becomes available at some point. The land of Catalogs is fairly peaceful during these missions, outside of a few mangy mutts that I refuse to kick, even though the developers apparently want me to because they're really annoying. And seriously, what's with dogs in video games? I don't want to hurt them, ever. Fuck off with this nonsense. At this point, it's safe to wander about, collect items for upgrades, and to catch sleazy government employees with their sex workers in tiny huts. Now, I didn't do much here outside of purchasing a few permanent offensive and defensive buffs, but there are quite a few gadgets to obtain for adventurous players. The final act consists of a few battle arenas filled with baddies and an end boss, who takes on a variety of forms. From start to finish, I'd say Mega Man Legends, or 64 if you prefer, has a good flow. Playing the games on easy gives the participant access to all of the weapons straight out of the gate, which was a strange decision. Legends really shines in the dungeons, ironically enough, while Mega Man is rummaging for doodads. I guess I just find it weird that the decreased difficulty diminishes this aspect of the game. There were a few finicky fights occasionally, but none that I'd consider challenging. Did I already say that? I think I did, yeah. Like there was this one bulldozer bot that I found extremely irritating to hit, until I realized you could get right up in it with bombs, and that Falcon fight was all sorts of clunky, but these are examples of mechanical issues not related to the difficulty.
Fire extinguishers aren't working.
What? It's inconceivable! How could a little punk like that ever defeat me?
I really enjoy the art style and the creative efforts as a whole here. The little Lego men are about as appealing to me as those low-life minion creatures from Despicable Me, but it's possible to shoot, boot, and set them ablaze after destroying their vehicles. It's unnecessary, but fun is fun, and hunting these bastards down to remove the smug little smiles off their faces never got old for me, in either version. The soundtrack is made up of dynamic cinematic tunes based off of a central musical theme. Makoto Tomozawa composed the score with a cinematic flavor that resembles his Resident Evil work more than the material he wrote for the 16-bit X entries, but there are a few catchy, classic Mega Man pieces peppered throughout. The Sony version has the superior audio quality, but that's no surprise. I normally side with the N64 when it comes to music because composers typically had to be a bit more creative with the limited cart space. Personally, I think this inspired more artists to think outside the box, and I legitimately believe the Nintendo console has a lot of solid, overlooked scores as a whole. Unfortunately, these tracks are more or less watered down versions of those from the PlayStation with a slightly muffled sound. It's barely noticeable while playing the game and good enough, but possibly another example of this being a late, lazy port to earn a few extra bucks before the release of the GameCube. Now that might sound overly critical, but I'm sure it's at least partially true. I'm also just nitpicking because these things are so damn similar. It's worth it to own either one of them. Just be sure to purchase them before they get cancelled for Tron Bond's inexplicably brazen display of blackface. If you thought her pole dancing skills were embarrassing, just wait until you see her antiquated comedy act.
Quick, right?
Good going. Next time on this channel, more Mega Man, so stay tuned.
Mega Man, good going!
I don't understand. Whenever I think about him, I get this funny feeling.